I'm Eric Parker. Coming up this morning on CT22, Themis Klarides announces her intention to run not for governor, but for U.S. Senate. So what does that mean for Republican Bob Stefanowski and his hopes to lead our state? And what about other Republicans interested in the Senate seat? We're digging into that with our own Susan Raff and Hearst Media's Dan Haar. After 30 years, the landmark school desegregation case, Sheff versus O'Neill, comes to a close with a settlement announced late last month. We're talking with one of the original lawyers on the case about the outcome. And it started simply. Dee Eggert brought her son to learn to skate lessons in New Haven to see if he liked skating. He did. He liked it so much, he's now getting ready to compete in the Olympics. The proud mom joins us to talk about the journey that got Zachary Donahue to the Winter Games again. It's all ahead this Sunday, February the 6th. CT22 starts right now.
From WFSB, this is CT22 with Eric Parker, sponsored by Hartford Healthcare.
Good morning. Thank you for being with us. She had been considering a run for governor, but there was a change of plans. Former State House Minority Leader Themis Klarides has decided instead to seek the Republican nomination for U.S. Senate, going after the seat now held by Richard Blumenthal. So how will that move change the race for governor and, of course, the race for Senate? Joining me this morning with analysis, WFSB chief political reporter Susan Raff and Dan Haar, columnist and associate editor at the Hearst, Connecticut media enterprise. Susan, I want to start with you. I feel like every time we talked about that governor race and we said, oh, and then Themis will jump in. And she took a different path. So what did you make about that?
Well, I think, Bob Stefanowski obviously out in front and center. I think he's been running since he lost the election. Many thought Themis was certainly going to run for governor, and then it came as a surprise. I think that she changed directions for a couple of reasons. One, because Bob Stefanowski was out there. He's already raised $10 million. Also, her husband is pretty high on the food chain up at Eversource, and I think that could have been toxic for her running for governor. And she took a different path.
Dan, she's not the only candidate in that race. Obviously, Richard Blumenthal running for re-election. But on the Republican side, there's some names in there and maybe some more names coming. Is it a clearer path to the nomination for her than governor would have been?
She's the clear front runner right now because she just announced the 40 Republican State Central Committee members supporting her. And that means that it's a likelihood that she wins the convention, which is a larger group of 1,100 delegates. You've got Peter Lumaj, the Albanian, refugee, escapee, who's got a great backstory, but his views are just way too far out of the mainstream. And he believes that the Democratic Party is going after an armed insurrection. I would point out that the only insurrection we've seen has not come from the Democrats. And a couple of other minor candidates who never had any chance. And frankly, the GOP owed it to the voters to come up with a better candidate, and they did. You also have Leora Levy, the Republican National Committee finance person, who's raised a ton of money for a ton of people, and she's close to announcing.
And of course, anytime you talk about someone who's raised a lot of money, you got to take that candidacy seriously. So I want to talk about governor, but let's talk just first about this race. Richard Blumenthal, been on ballots in Connecticut for, a gazillion years. Republicans have a tough time in these statewide elections sometimes in Connecticut. Does Themis Klarides change that?
Well, Dan and I think, disagree on this. I think Richard Blumenthal is the top vote getter in state elections. He is very much a household name. I think you would be hard-pressed to find anyone and maybe say, well, that's just visible, not necessarily performance. But I think it's tough to knock off a Democrat in Connecticut. I don't think we've had a Republican senator for, 40 years? So I think that he is pretty secure, but I know Dan disagrees.
Well, I'm not to say that he's insecure, but remember, the whole reason that Themis Klarides got into this race and not governor, aside from the reasons that that Susan said, is name recognition. You're in the Capitol, everybody loves you, everybody knows who you are, you're a big shot, you hold press conferences, you walk across the street, nobody knows who you are. So name recognition is a problem. Nonetheless, I just don't think Dick Blumenthal is as unbeatable as people think. He's turning 76 in 2 weeks, not in 2 years, in 2 weeks. He doesn't have a lack of energy, but the system wears on you after a while. He may be beatable if something happens. If nothing happens going forward, he'll be the clear front runner. I'm not saying that he's going to be beaten. I'm just saying he's not unbeatable.
He's got almost $7 million in cash.
6.9, right?
So he's got that. And I'd be curious to see what Levy has. She is obviously a big fundraiser in the Republican Party. More notable, I think, in Fairfield County, in that area, but she also she was born in Cuba. She has that history behind her, but she's a huge fundraiser for the Republican Party. She was also in charge of the finances for Bob Stefanowski's campaign, so she understands what it takes, or somewhat of what it takes, to run for governor or elected office.
She'll be able to raise enough money, both from her own wealth and from other people that owe her favors from raising money all those years. She'll have no trouble raising money. That's not the only thing. But that's going to be a big deal. And so I do think that Themis would be the front runner in the race. Name recognition matters also, of course, for Leora Levy. She's known in the party, but not to anyone in the public.
Not outside. Now, it also, of course, this has a big impact on the race for governor. Can we just put it down in pen? Stefanowski, Lamont, that's it?
I think so.
I vote yes.
I vote yes, too. Okay, we agree on that.
There have been, a lot is being made of the fact that this would be a rare absence of a primary. But Roland didn't face primaries early in his efforts either. And of course, when there's a sitting Republican governor, whether Roland or Rel, there were no primaries. So he's going to have a much bigger advantage, not only because he won't have to spend money on the primary. He doesn't need the name recognition that a primary gets you, so that wouldn't have helped him. And he won't have Themis Klarides running from his left, forcing him to account for Trump and Trumpism. And he's going to be able to continue to skirt those issues as he has the whole time.
I also think Stefanowski is smarter this time around. We had a conversation on a podcast that I host, and he said he's learned from some of his mistakes the first time around. If you remember, he didn't go to the convention last time. And he also kind of snubbed the municipalities. He didn't think that he needed them. And he has admitted that he's learned from that. So he almost seems like a kinder, gentler Bob Stefanowski, and smarter. So maybe he will gain more traction this time around.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
We had that picture of him standing. He's a big guy, Big Bob. That's why we call him. Standing over, who was it? Stemmerman. Pointing a finger at his chest and all this. You won't see that this time around.
No.
What do you think the big issues will be in the governor's race? Do you think that will be a hotly contested, close down to the finish like it was 4 years ago?
Well, it's interesting. I think if this election was maybe a year ago, things would be a little bit different. I think that Ned Lamont gets high marks for the pandemic, and still does. I think people realize, even Bob Stefanowski said when he came out announcing his candidacy that there's no blueprint, right? But as this pandemic wears on, and people are frustrated and angry with mask mandates and executive orders and emergency powers, I think people are going to get frustrated with that. I think inflation may be out there as well in the economy, but I think the pandemic is a huge issue. And on another note, I also think for the legislature, and Democrats are going to have to come up with some legislation to deal with what's happening in our communities with crime and car thefts.
I think the issues are more external to Connecticut than internal. You have to remember, Biden, of course, is not historically unpopular. Trump was unpopular 1 year in as well, of course. But he's unpopular, and if inflation stays at 7%, or heaven forbid goes up from there, the Democrats in both of these races, Blumenthal and Lamont, will have trouble. If foreign policy blows up, that's going to be a bigger issue, obviously, on the Senate side. But if there's a war in Ukraine, that's not helping the Democrats. It's not looking like a stable situation. And so that's an impression that voters are left with. I think the national picture is a lot more important, and that's why, for the first time since '06, the Democrats could win, or the Republicans could win a statewide race.
All right. Well, we have the legislative session opening up as well in just a couple days. We'll have to talk about that another time because we're all out of time on that. But that's, of course, the backdrop to these races, that they're up there legislating in Hartford while all this is happening. So Susan Raff, Dan Haar, thank you both for being with us here on CT22.
Thank you.
Great to be here.